Mark Standen spent decades building a career on the right side of the law. He worked for the Australian Federal Police, Customs, and later became Assistant Director of Investigations at the New South Wales Crime Commission. His job was to investigate some of the most dangerous drug traffickers in Australia. He had access to sensitive intelligence, police methods, international contacts, and information that ordinary criminals could only dream of getting. Then investigators discovered something almost impossible to believe. One of the men fighting the drug trade had secretly become part of it. Standen was not a low-level officer. He was one of the senior people trusted to fight organized crime. For years, he had worked on major drug investigations and built a reputation as an experienced crime fighter. He knew how police investigations worked, how intelligence was gathered, and how criminals were tracked. That knowledge would later become one of the most important parts of the case against him. The strange story began with a man named James Henry Kinch. In 2003, Standen was involved in Kinch's arrest. Kinch was connected to an international drug network based in the Netherlands. Instead of remaining simply an arrested criminal and police informant, Kinch eventually developed a secret relationship with Standen. Standen had been managing Kinch as an informant, but prosecutors later showed that the relationship had crossed a very different line. According to later investigations, Kinch and Standen became friends and secretly met around Sydney. Standen also helped Kinch with his legal problems. He even pushed for drug and money laundering charges against Kinch to be dropped. After Kinch was released, Standen began receiving secret payments connected to him. The relationship had changed completely. The investigator was now helping the person he was supposed to be watching. Another important person entered the story: Bakos, or Bill Jalality, a food importer. Jalality was a friend of Standen and had business connections that could help move shipments. Investigators later discovered that Standen, Kinch, and Jalality were involved in a plan to bring a huge amount of pseudoephedrine into Australia. Pseudoephedrine itself is a chemical that can be used to manufacture methamphetamine, commonly known as ice. The planned shipment was enormous. Prosecutors said the conspiracy involved at least 300 kilograms of pseudoephedrine. Authorities estimated that the chemical could have been used to produce tens of millions of dollars worth of illegal drugs. Some reports put the potential value at around $60 million, while the broader importation was described in court as a $120 million drug plot. The plan involved disguising the shipment as something ordinary. Investigators heard discussions about bringing the chemical into Australia inside bags of rice from Pakistan. On the surface, it could look like a normal commercial shipment. Behind that appearance was a plan involving an international drug network and people who understood exactly how dangerous the cargo was. But Standen had something the other criminals did not have. He understood law enforcement from the inside. He knew the kind of information police looked for. He knew how investigations could be damaged. He knew the importance of secrecy. And because of his position, he had access to intelligence about organized crime that could be extremely valuable to criminals. This was one reason the case was so serious. It was not simply a police officer accepting money from a criminal. It was a senior investigator allegedly using the knowledge he had gained from fighting crime to help criminals. The authorities eventually became suspicious of Standen. The Australian Federal Police began a secret investigation. This was extremely sensitive because the man being investigated worked inside the very system responsible for fighting organized crime. If word of the investigation leaked, the entire operation could have been destroyed. Investigators began collecting evidence through intercepted communications and surveillance. Phone calls, emails, and secretly recorded meetings would become some of the most important evidence in the case. Standen was no longer just a name in a police file. Investigators were listening to conversations and watching what he was doing. In September 2007, Standen and Jalality were secretly recorded during a meeting at a cafe in Sydney. Their conversation concerned the money that could be made from the drug shipment. The discussion showed investigators that this was not simply a casual conversation. Money, quantities, and shares of the expected profit were being discussed. The operation continued for months. Police were careful because Standen was experienced enough to understand surveillance. At the same time, investigators were also watching people connected to him. They were trying to understand the entire network without allowing Standen to discover what was happening. Then, in June 2008, the career of one of Australia's senior crime investigators came crashing down. Standen was arrested by the Australian Federal Police. The man who had spent years questioning criminals was now the person being questioned. The arrest was recorded, and even Standen appeared to struggle to believe what was happening. He was being arrested for conspiracy to import a commercial quantity of a controlled precursor. The case went to trial. Standen denied that he had committed the crimes, but prosecutors presented a large collection of evidence, including intercepted calls, emails, and recordings of meetings. The trial lasted around 5 months and involved almost 100 days of evidence. The prosecution argued that Standen was deeply involved in the conspiracy. They said he was not simply pretending to be involved as part of some secret police operation. He was actually helping the criminal plan. They also argued that his law enforcement knowledge made him especially useful to the group. The jury eventually agreed with the prosecution. In August 2011, Standen was found guilty of conspiring to import and supply 300 kilograms of pseudoephedrine. He was also convicted of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. The conviction was a huge shock to Australia's law enforcement community. Standen had spent his career fighting organized crime. Now he had been convicted of becoming part of an organized criminal conspiracy himself. The person who had once helped investigators understand criminals was now sitting on the other side of the courtroom. In December 2011, Justice Bruce James sentenced Standen to a maximum of 22 years in prison. He would be eligible for parole after serving 16 years. The judge said Standen had used inside knowledge gained during roughly 3 decades in law enforcement to commit the crimes. The court also heard that the expected profits from the criminal operation were many millions of dollars. Standen's financial situation became an important part of the story. During the trial, prosecutors argued that he was desperate for money because he had spent beyond his means. An earlier report also noted that his superiors knew he had a gambling problem. Money appeared to be one of the pressures surrounding his corruption. But the case was bigger than one man's greed. Standen's actions created a serious problem for the entire justice system. Police officers are trusted with information that ordinary people cannot access. They know about investigations, informants, surveillance, and criminal networks. When that information is abused, criminals can gain an advantage that money alone cannot buy. And that is exactly what made Standen's case so disturbing. He did not simply step outside the law one day. According to later investigations, his corruption had deeper roots than the public initially understood. For years, the official picture was that Standen had become corrupt around 2007, and that the drug conspiracy was essentially a single major crime. But a later investigation by ABC's Four Corners challenged that version of events. Documents showed that the Australian Federal Police had suspected Standen of being involved in multiple drug imports as early as 2006. Investigators also believed he had been involved in an abandoned plan involving the movement of a huge amount of money out of Australia through a meat export scheme. These allegations went beyond the crime for which he was ultimately convicted. They showed that investigators had questions about how deep his corruption may have gone. There was another troubling part of the story. Standen had access to major criminal investigations while secretly maintaining relationships with people connected to organized crime. Later reporting found evidence that he had sabotaged investigations and protected criminals. The exact extent of his actions remains part of the wider controversy surrounding his career. The damage did not stop with Standen himself. The New South Wales Crime Commission was badly embarrassed by the scandal. The organization had trusted him with some of its most sensitive work. People who worked with him had to face the uncomfortable question of how someone in such a powerful position had been able to become corrupt without being caught earlier. Standen appealed his conviction and sentence. In 2015, the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal rejected his appeal. His convictions and sentence therefore remained in place. He eventually spent 16 years behind bars. In June 2024, after completing that period, Standen was released from prison. But even after his release, he continued to maintain that he had done nothing wrong. Former senior police figures strongly disagreed with him and described his legacy as deeply damaging to the people and institutions that had trusted him. The story of Mark Standen is not really about a cop suddenly becoming a criminal overnight. It is about trust. For decades, Standen was given power because people believed he was using that power to protect the public. He was allowed inside the rooms where Australia's most important organized crime investigations were discussed. He had access to information that criminals wanted. He knew the people hunting them because he was one of those people. Then that trust became part of the criminal operation. The most disturbing part is that the criminals did not need to break into the police system. They had someone inside it. That is what makes cases like this so dangerous. A criminal on the street can be arrested. A corrupt officer with access to police intelligence can potentially damage investigations before anyone knows there is a problem. Standen's case also shows the strange relationship between law enforcement and the criminals they investigate. Police sometimes use criminals as informants, because informants can provide information that officers cannot get on their own. But that relationship requires strict control. In Standen's case, according to the evidence presented at trial and later investigations, the relationship with informant James Kinch became something completely different. The investigator and the criminal were no longer simply on opposite sides. They were connected by money, trust, and a shared criminal plan. And once that line was crossed, the badge that was supposed to stop crime became part of the problem. Mark Standen had spent much of his adult life learning how criminals operated. He understood their methods, their networks, and their weaknesses. In the end, prosecutors said he used that knowledge for the exact purpose he had once been paid to prevent. He went from investigating drug traffickers to being convicted of conspiring to import the ingredients for millions of dollars worth of illegal drugs, from one side of the interrogation table to the other, from senior crime investigator to convicted criminal, and from a man trusted to protect the system to one of the most damaging corruption cases in Australia's law enforcement history. The lesson is simple. The badge does not make someone honest. The position does not make someone trustworthy. Those things have to be protected every day, because sometimes the biggest threat to a criminal investigation is not the person hiding outside the police station. It can be the person already sitting inside it.